Drifting around in the halls of time are the peculiar twists of fate that leave us questioning our reality. Events align in the most peculiar of ways. Patterns form, and a morbid symmetry dominates the darkness, each echoing the universe's dark and twisted humor. Number 10. There are many figures that dominate our past. Some were heroes, others were treacherous, bringing darkness upon the world. Somewhere between those two titles lies a general, an emperor, and a tyrant, the dominating historical figure of the French Revolution of the 18th century, Napoleon Bonaparte. After rising to prominence during this period, he was named Emperor of France, a position he held from 1804 to 1814, and then again in 1815. Much of Napoleon's history is dominated by the Napoleonic Wars, which began in 1803 and ended in 1815 with his death. But it wasn't just wars and battles that this historical figure was known for. During his rule, the general saw somewhere between 20 and 30 assassination plots against his life. This included kidnapping attempts, attacks on his carriage, and even a poisoned snuff box. The most famous failed attempt, though, was one that was blundered by pure coincidence. The plot took place in 1800, before Napoleon had risen in the ranks. The plot, despite being so thoroughly planned and seemingly foolproof, would be thwarted by something as simple as an outfit change and an intoxicated driver. It began on the 24th of December that year, when the conspirators came together to finalize their efforts. 3 men put together an explosive device known as the Infernal Machine and placed it in a wine cart and hid it along the route that Napoleon's carriage would be taking to get to the Paris Opera. To time the moment the explosion would go off, they enlisted the help of a young girl. They told her to guard the cart, and that when she saw the cavalry escort, she was to take hold of the horse. The conspirators expected Napoleon's carriage to come after said escort, which would signal the moment that the powder would need to be lit. But early that day, the general's wife, Josephine, had caused some delay when trying to arrange a new shawl. While the coachmen awaited their passengers, Napoleon's driver allegedly took a few swigs of an alcoholic beverage. Eventually, they were ready, with Napoleon boarding his own carriage and Josephine following behind him. Because they were now running behind schedule, Napoleon's coachman began to speed up and was then swerving and weaving all over the place when those few swigs from earlier finally caught up to him. He overtook the cavalry and was now approaching the hidden explosive, but the carriage was coming much too quickly, and the young girl gave the signal too late. One of the men lit the powder, and a blast echoed through the region, but Napoleon was not among the fatalities. He had passed the cart just moments before the explosion was detonated. The blast merely shattered the windows of his vehicle. Josephine was unharmed too. She'd come within the blast radius just moments after Napoleon, with the cavalry following behind her. While the general and his people continued to the opera unscathed, the same cannot be said of the bystanders. At least a dozen of those who'd been in the vicinity were left deceased, including young Marianne and the horse that stood by the cart. Number 9. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist and psychiatrist, and the founder of analytical psychology. He developed concepts of introverted and extroverted personalities, archetypes, and also delved into the collective unconscious. His work would ultimately lead him to the incredible phenomenon of coincidence, a concept that he would become the teacher of. He spoke of inner and outer worlds, the unconscious mind, and acausal connection. It would be these very ideas and teachings that would culminate one day into the perfect example as to what Jung meant by synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence of 2 or more events where something other than probability of chance is involved. While working as a psychologist, Jung was treating a young woman described as highly educated and serious. One day, she walked into his office, where her doctor noticed that her quest for psychological change was non-existent. Jung realized that the only way he'd be able to help her was if something unexpected and irrational would turn up, allowing him to break through, or at least soften her rationalistic shell. As she sat in the chair, the young woman began to tell the psychologist of a peculiar dream she had the night before. She explained that in the dream, a piece of jewelry was gifted to her. It took the form of a golden scarab beetle, a costly piece. Jung was familiar with the symbol being represented here. The beetle was an Egyptian symbol he believed correlated not only with the end of something, but also with transformation. As he listened, the psychologist paced the room looking for his unexpected and irrational thing. Eventually, he resigned himself to his chair and listened to the continuation of his patient's story. It was just then that a peculiar tapping sound grabbed his attention. It was coming from behind him. As he turned, Jung saw an insect fluttering against the window. He went over and opened it, allowing the creature to fly in so that he could capture it. As he opened his cupped hand, his patient peered inside, and inside was the scarab beetle. Though a different color than what she had seen, the beetle was the closest analogy to the young woman's story. Not only did the dream symbol correspond to the transformation Jung wanted for his patient, but it also manifested physically, with the inner world becoming the outer world. Additionally, the psychologist got what he hoped for, the unexpected and irrational. Rose Schaefers were common around the time of this event occurred, but what was unusual was that the room in which Jung and his patient were in was dark. Trying to enter a dimly lit room was deemed uncharacteristic for the species. It was as though it had arrived there with a purpose. Even more synchronized was the fact that this event would happen to the very person developing the term and its understanding. Upon seeing the beetle, the patient was amazed and now listened to her doctor, who seemed like a magician after producing the Schaefer for her. Her defenses dropped and even allowed Jung to find a supporting example for his concepts of archetype and the unus mundus to explain it all. Number 8. In the early 1940s, a young woman from Ottawa, Canada, would give birth to 2 sons. For reasons not entirely known, they were both taken into the care of the Children's Aid Society, where they'd be placed on adoption lists. While still young, one of the boys was adopted and given the name Ron Cole. He remained in Ottawa with the Cole family for much of his upbringing. When he became a young adult, though, Ron decided to move away from his hometown. He lost touch with many of his childhood friends and became a farmer. At least 2 decades later, though, the sense of curiosity overwhelmed the man, now in his 40s, so much that he began searching for his birth family. He started trying to locate his biological mother, only to discover she was no longer alive. Undeterred by this, he soon learned that he had both a brother and a sister too, and the quest to find them would continue for the next 25 years. As part of his search effort, Ron would make contact with a volunteer group known as Parent Finders Ottawa. For years, the organization had focused on this case, scouring records, papers, and DNA as they tried to find the missing siblings. It wasn't until 2013 that this endeavor would finally prove valuable. That year, the organization identified one of the siblings, Ron's brother. After securing Duncan's contact details, he learned that his biological brother was living in Guernsey in the English Channel. The name Duncan Cumming sounded so familiar to Ron that he just had to meet him, and no one would have expected what came next. The name was familiar to him because Duncan Cumming had been Ron Cole's childhood friend. The two had attended grade school together and were friends at Muchmore Public School. A black and white image of 2 boys, one holding a beach ball and the other sporting a baseball hat on a beach in Ottawa, served as a testament to this friendship. The one holding the ball was Ron, the other was Duncan. They were good friends until they reached the age of 13, when Ron moved away to Saskatchewan, and Duncan moved to Guernsey. Neither of those boys knew it then, but they weren't just friends, they were brothers, who, despite being separated at birth, still managed to grow up together in a strange, coincidental twist. Number 7. It was during the American Civil War that a prominent figure rose through the ranks to become a Confederate military leader. John Brown Gordon hadn't accomplished much during his first 29 years of life. He attended the University of Georgia, but didn't graduate. He also abandoned his law practice to develop coal mines in the northwestern tip. Gordon lacked military education and experience, but when elected captain of a mountaineering group, his capabilities were revealed. He climbed the ranks from captain to brigadier general, then to major general, then lieutenant general. Gordon was present at many Civil War battles and subsequently became a hero. The military leader turned out not to be as unaccomplished after all. Aside from being a successful leader, Gordon had another achievement to add to his list, having 9 lives. It was this Civil War-era figure who would survive several attempts on his life, one of which was only by pure chance. On a sunken farm road in Maryland, he lay on the ground, when only moments earlier he'd be standing tall, proud, and using his booming voice to rally the 6th Alabama Infantry. He'd stood there shouting at the troops, with wounds made by stray bullets in 2 of his limbs. Vital fluid showed from 2 holes on his right leg, and more streamed down his left arm and shoulder. Then suddenly, another bullet slammed straight into Gordon's face. Thinking that was it, his life was over, he fell to the ground, face first into the soil. As he lay there, waiting to breathe his last, the leader discovered that he wasn't breathing that last breath at all. It turned out that his wound wasn't fatal, and had missed both his brain and major vessels. What would have been fatal, though, was drowning in his own vital fluid. Gordon had collapsed into his own hat, and it was now pooling with red liquid, or at least it should have been. The military official managed to roll over, coughing and choking, but alive. He was later carried off the battlefield, hat in tow, and was treated by a medic. Gordon discovered a tiny hole in his hat, one that had been made earlier that day during an exchange. It was this very hole that had acted like a drain, ultimately saving his life. Gordon made a full recovery from all the wounds he'd sustained during the Maryland battle and lived to tell the tale. Number 6. In 1979, a German magazine decided to hold a writing competition. They instructed readers to write and submit bizarre stories for their paper the following week. The twist was that the unusual stories had to be based on real-life events or things that happened to them personally. The magazine received numerous entries and chose a few of them to feature in the following week's paper. Among them was obviously the winner of the competition. The winner was a man named Walter Kellner from Munich. He wrote to the magazine detailing a bizarre story that happened to him personally. On a specific date, Walter explained that he'd been flying his Cessna 421 and was hovering above the open waters between Sardinia and Sicily, when suddenly his plane encountered some trouble with the engine. After failing to correct the error, Walter suggested that he was forced to make an emergency landing. The plane dropped smoothly onto the sea below, and the pilot was able to get a hold of the emergency dinghy, which he would then spend quite a bit of time in. Eventually, rescuers spotted him and were able to pull him from the water. Walter survived the ordeal, allowing him to retell the miraculous story. Upon the release of the article, though, the magazine found themselves facing some legal issues. Someone had read the paper and found the story to be incredibly familiar. They'd heard it all before. The reader realized that their friend from Austria had this exact same event happen to him. But why would he be entering a German competition to retell the story? When posed this very question, the friend, also named Walter Kellner from Austria, began to believe that an act of plagiarism was at play here. He wrote to the paper and told them that whoever had written the story had stolen it from him because he had the exact same thing happen to him. The newspaper investigated the claim, only to find something most coincidental. The 2 Walter Kellners were different people, yet their stories were eerily the same. The Austrian Walter explained that he'd flown his Cessna 421 over the same area, experienced engine trouble, and was forced to land in the same water. He spent much of his time in the dinghy while awaiting rescue. The newspaper investigated both stories, and both of them really did happen on separate dates, but in the exact same manner. They were both true and identical, in a bizarre coincidence. Number 5. Obscured by more sensational events, yet still documented in the media, was the bizarre habit of President John F. Kennedy, who kept the husk of a coconut on the table in the Oval Office. As strange as it was, there was a story attached to it, which suggests a symbol of resilience to Kennedy. This is because a coconut miraculously saved his life not once, but twice. It was the early morning hours of the 2nd of August, 1943. Moving through the waters was an American PT boat, number 109. Out of nowhere, a Japanese destroyer appeared. It rammed straight into the American vessel, slicing it in half. The damage was so severe that the other PT boats assumed the crew was done for and left the area. But 11 of the 13 crew members were still alive and were now floundering in the water, clinging to any piece of debris they could find. For the next 5 hours, they were adrift until they eventually reached a coral island. One by one, they dragged themselves to shore. Among them, a young John F. Kennedy appeared. He'd been in the boat too, serving as a junior grade lieutenant. He was among the 11 survivors to make it to land. For some time, he would swim out to sea, hoping to flag down a passing ship, but none came. The small island had limited food, offering only coconuts as sustenance. After one trip into the water, the 26-year-old Kennedy found himself feeling ill, and upon making it to shore, he gulped down some coconuts, allowing him to regain his strength. By now, they'd been without food for several hours, and the coconuts offered much-needed nutrition, which ultimately saved them from starvation. The crew soon realized that they would have to travel to a larger island, where they might find some locals who could help them. For the next several days, on Cross Island, the men would attempt to flag down passing ships, but received no help. They lived off the coconuts on this island too, until finally help arrived. 2 Solomon Islanders were passing by in a canoe when Kennedy and the crew yelled from the shore and waved their hands. The natives stopped and steered their canoe to the beach. Kennedy would ask them if they could take a message to the American forces who were on the other island, and they agreed. Kennedy grabbed a coconut husk and a sharp object and began carving into the hairy bark of the drupe. It was a message that read, "Naro, ISL, Commander Native knows position. He can pilot. 11 alive. Need a small boat. Kennedy." The Islanders made good on their promise and delivered the message to Lieutenant Arthur Evans, who'd been watching the coast of Gomu Island. A small boat was subsequently sent out, and the crew paddled to Gomu. From there, another PT boat would take them back to Rendova. 2 decades after this ordeal, the junior lieutenant was elected President of the United States, which may never have happened if that message hadn't been scrawled upon one of the most improbable mediums, a coconut. Number 4. Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th President of the United States, was the individual who brought post-Civil War Reconstruction to an end in the South. He also attempted to establish new standards of integrity following an 8-year blight of corruption in D.C. Hayes would be the only president ever who would hold office by the decision of an extraordinary commission of legislators, as well as high court judges who were intentionally selected to resolve disputes over election votes. Hayes served from 1877 to 1881. 16 years after Hayes's last year in office, William McKinley would become the 25th President of the United States. Under his leadership, the U.S. would go to war with Spain. He came into power in 1897, and just a year later, he would acquire a global empire that included Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. His term lasted until 1901. The reason these 2 very different presidents, separated by nearly 2 decades, are mentioned together is that they go back much further than we ever may have guessed. It would be the 19th president, Hayes, and the 25th president, McKinley, whose connection runs back to when the Civil War had just begun, serving in the same Union Army regiment, only to stick together like inseparable shadows, with one following the other into office. Hayes began his Civil War career in the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry as an officer. It didn't take long before he secured the position of general, after which he spent much of his time in Western Virginia. He would be wounded there at least 4 times. With Hayes looking over 341 men in the regiment, among them was a private who turned out to be William McKinley. Although he was one among hundreds, McKinley had caught the attention of Hayes after he proved himself time and time again on the battlefield. One notable moment occurred at the Battle of Antietam. When news of his bravery had reached the general, he suggested that McKinley be promoted to second lieutenant. The higher-ranking officials did just that, and he would then serve on Hayes' staff. By the time the war had ended, McKinley had climbed the ranks and was listed as a brevet major for his bravery and distinguished service. After serving under Hayes, the major would view him as a mentor, and Hayes would view him as his protege. From there, a lifelong and political and personal alliance grew, despite the occasional differences. Number 3. Before lottery games were legalized across the world, the citizens of the United States were forced to engage in illegal gambling. One such money-consuming gamble was the numbers game. The patrons came mostly from low-income backgrounds, eager and desperate to win a large sum of money by spending their own money. In the numbers game, the player would have to bet an amount under $1 and select their own 3-digit number from 000 to 999. The game's winning numbers would be drawn from a source the promoters did not control, ensuring a fair game. The odds against winning the jackpot are 999 to 1. The winner would be paid 540 to 1, and the runner who accepted the bet would receive 60 units. The bettor is persuaded by the idea that a 10-cent risk may yield $54. Promoters of the illegal numbers game would also spend a great deal of the money bet to pay police, protecting them from arrest. It was on the 17th of September, 1958, that the Manhattan numbers game saw many of its players betting the same number. That number was 932. When the promoters announced the winning digits, many were shocked to find that this exact number had come up. As a result, thousands of people won, and the promoters were required to pay each of them. The reason that so many people chose this number was that it had been appearing in the newspapers frequently around that time, and for a tragic reason. It was 2 days before the betting numbers were placed that one of the most tragic railroad disasters in New Jersey's history would take place. On the 15th of September, 1958, a diesel-powered commuter train was traveling on the Central Railroad. It had departed from Bayhead and was headed to Jersey City. To get there, trains would have to cross over the 4-track Newark Bay drawbridge. It would be at this point of the route that disaster would strike. Upon crossing over the 1.5-mile span of track, the train was supposed to slow down to 22 miles an hour, but it was going twice that speed. Adding to this already unnerving scenario, and unbeknownst to those on board, was that the drawbridge they were on had been partially opened to allow a dredging barge to pass beneath it. The signals had been lit way too slowly, and efforts to stop the train were futile. The fast-moving train barreled past 3 signal markers and hit a derailing device, which was supposed to be the last safety measure that would stop the train from plunging into the bay. Unfortunately, this automatic device also failed, and 2 locomotives were plunged into murky waters 40 feet below, followed shortly by 2 coaches. The carts sank, and on the edge of the tracks dangled the 3rd cart, number 932. 2 hours later, it toppled into the water. In those 2 hours, the media had swarmed the area and photographed the wreck, with the number 932 hanging sideways from the track, looming over the dark waters. The next day, the images appeared in the Jersey Journal, Daily News, and Associated Press, and 2 days later in the numbers game. The grim scene and eerie digits became a fortuitous coincidence for bettors. Number 2. Jefferson Davis, born in Christian County, Kentucky, served as the President of the Confederate States of America throughout its existence during the American Civil War, which began in 1861 and lasted 4 years. Jefferson's presidency was marked by controversial decisions, important events, but also shadowed a coincidence that seemed to follow him wherever he went, quite literally. It was 1862 when he decided to embark on a journey around the Confederate Circle, where he would visit several command stations. His trip would take him to Virginia, Tennessee, and Mississippi. Allegedly, Davis would visit Fredericksburg, Virginia in early December, and leave for Tennessee a few days later. Upon his departure from the area, the Battle of Fredericksburg rang out and lasted several days, becoming the largest and most fatal battle of the Civil War. It saw the loss of almost 200,000 combatants, the greatest loss of life that resulted from any Civil War engagement. The Confederate side won the battle, with the Union Army suffering over 12,500 casualties. As people were losing their lives here over a 4-day period, Davis was all the way in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where he was visiting the troops stationed there. He arrived in Murfreesboro on the 12th of December, and again left after a few days for his next location in Mississippi. Less than 3 weeks later, the major fight known as the Battle of Stones River, also known as the Second Battle of Murfreesboro, commenced. It began on the 31st of December and lasted until early January 1863. The conflict was red-stained, and this time it was the Union side that won. The victory boosted their morale in the North and gave the Federals control of central Tennessee. Among the major battles of the Civil War era, the Battle of Stones River had the highest percentage of casualties on both sides. In the middle of May, Davis would make his way to Richmond, where he discussed the defense of the Confederacy with Robert E. Lee and James Longstreet. During their conversations, Davis expressed his concern over Vicksburg and whether or not they should attempt to relieve tensions and pressure in that area, or concentrate their forces elsewhere. Just 3 days after this concern was discussed, on the 18th of May 1863, the siege of Vicksburg began. The location was strategically placed on the Mississippi River, making this a critical win for either side. The siege would last a harrowing 47 days, until finally the Confederate troops surrendered. This marked the turning point for the Union Army. Davis would later express his surprise and his dismay over the loss. It was also eerily coincidental that he conveyed his concern over Vicksburg and debated over sending troops to the area, which he ended up not doing, only to have the Union defeat the Confederate soldiers who were there. The timing between each of his departures from these areas and the clashes that followed is often noted as particularly significant in Confederate military history, and all of them followed the same synchronized pattern of coincidence. Number 1. Imagine meticulously planning and setting up an intricate system to carry out an assassination, only to have it ruined by the target's coincidental decision to change their plans. It would be this very frustration that George Elser would be left with in 1939. Elser was a 36-year-old carpenter who lived in a small town in southern Germany and wasn't affiliated with any communist group, nor was he overly political. Elser, historians claim, had a profound sense of justice. When the German dictator came into power and havoc was unleashed upon Germany, the assassin began to make small gestures of defiance. They manifest in ways such as refusing to listen to speeches made by the dictator. By the late 1930s, his concern over the drive towards the war had reached its peak, and he decided that something had to be done. Elser got to work on an explosive device, one that he would use to exterminate the man whom he viewed as a hateful, ruthless, and brutal tyrant. Elser would also have to change his defiance tactics and begin listening to the broadcasts, but only to learn of his target's next move. He learned that the dictator planned to deliver his annual speech on the 8th of November, 1939, at a Munich beer hall. The event was to commemorate the early struggles that the forces faced in the 1920s. The leader would also use this opportunity to mock his enemies and boast about the start of the war. In the weeks leading up to this event, the assassin made his move. He assembled and planted his explosive device in the hall, secretly, without being seen. The day of the event arrived, and the tick of the timer was muffled by its cork casing, allowing it to go undetected as the leader took his position at the podium. The highest-ranking officials standing behind him and the loyal audience in front were so completely unaware of the sinister device that lurked nearby. The dictator usually began his speech at the same time each year, but this time he was eager to return to Berlin. He wanted to meet his military planners as the Second World War was in its infancy. The speech started as usual, but the leader unexpectedly cut it short, leaving a whole 13 minutes early. Of course, the assassins didn't know this yet. 13 minutes later, with the hall and streets still bustling, the explosive went off. 8 people would lose their lives, but among them was no war leader.